Want to bring some happy news to you in the Second Amendment community, specifically the number of guns, including AR-15 style firearms or semi-automatic rifles, continues to skyrocket all across the country, showing that the right to keep and bear arms is a lived experience among tens, if not hundreds of millions of Americans every day. Let's break down some of the data that have come out in the last few days. Hey folks, I'm Mark Smith, host of the Four Boxes Diner, proud American gun owner, constitutional attorney, member of the United States Supreme Court Bar, and I'm proud to say a top 5 finalist in 2 separate categories for the 2024 Gundies Awards out in Las Vegas. The first one for a top male influencer in the Second Amendment space, and the second category is the top voice of the Second Amendment in the United States. I'm proud to be in both categories and a finalist in both. All right, folks, so overall, great news, although this headline I'm about to read is a little bit of a mixed blessing. I was reading Zero Hedge, which if you don't follow zerohedge.com, you may want to check them out. A lot of quirky news, pretty good news out there, and I get a different perspective, especially on financial markets, by the way, but they cover a lot of political and social, cultural issues as well. So check out zerohedge.com if you haven't already looked at it. They had a really interesting article on Sunday, and this is the title of the article that caught my eye. Law-abiding Americans reject Biden's border invasion and imploding cities by buying more guns. That's right. The Zero Hedge article came out and said that new data shows that the 2023 firearm purchases among law-abiding Americans remain elevated. This comes as the Biden administration floods the nation with millions of illegals, presumably illegal immigrants, on the southern border, and Democrats controlling major metro areas have sparked a violent crime crisis in recent years due to failed social justice reforms. Obviously, the fact that we no longer have a border, which suggests how are we even a country if you don't have a border, and that we have a skyrocketing violent crime rate problem all across the blue cities, if you will. Obviously, that's not good news. But the fact is that what is positive, if you want to look at the silver lining here, is that Americans realize, finally, that they are their own first responder, that the government calling 911, relying on the government, relying on Eric Adams, relying on the mayors of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and D.C. to protect you is a fool's errand. It's simply not going to work. So it's very important that Americans are getting the right message. They're understanding the reality on the ground is that the government, whether they call 911 or not, is not going to be there to protect them. When seconds count, police are minutes away, except in Israel, where seconds count, apparently the IDF is hours away. That's a separate issue. Nevertheless, let's carry on. The Zero Hedge article goes on to say that Americans know that the country is in big trouble. We could have a debate about that, but this is what the article is saying. Americans know the country is in big trouble. The government is allowing an invasion of the southern border, and Democratic-run metro areas resemble scenes from the violent video game Grand Theft Auto. So powerful language here in the Zero Hedge article. I'll put a link to it down below. Then it goes on, and this is quite important. It's pointing out the obvious, which is that folks, meaning Americans, are waking up and understanding that the police forces that used to be around are being stripped down. Not only, I think, are they being stripped down sort of in terms of numerosity, the numbers of police officers, but I suspect, having talked to many people that I'm friendly with in the law enforcement community, police are really choosing not to aggressively patrol, aggressively police, and they're really kind of more responsive. And I, frankly, in many respects, can't blame them. Yes, you have to do your job, but I do understand that today the incentives for many police officers across the country is simply to don't go to prison, don't lose your pension, don't get fired, don't get sued into oblivion. I understand that we have created an incentive system in many parts of this country to discourage police from protecting innocents and the law-abiding against from obvious violent criminal thugs. And as to why that's the case, I'll let you do your own surmising here. But the reality is there is certainly a discouragement of police and government all around the country to protect us. Now, whether or not that's intentional, because certain political leaders want there to be disruption and destruction in our streets to therefore cause people to beg for more government programs, more social workers, more and bigger and greater government control, and more, for example, gun control. Whether or not you think people are intentionally doing this to get to those political outcomes, you can tell me that. But whatever the intent of why these policies exist in the United States, the reality is that Americans are starting to notice more and more about these policies, and they're taking it upon themselves to protect themselves with more and more guns, which is why we are having these data about more and more gun ownership. Specifically, the article goes on to talk about data from the National Shooting Sports Foundation. Presumably, this data is starting to come out by the National Shooting Sports Foundation in anticipation of SHOT Show next week. And this is what the National Shooting Sports Foundation says, that there are nearly 16 million gun sales. There were nearly 16 million gun sales in 2023, with December alone seeing upwards of 1.7 million. Now, this doesn't count, of course, people who acquire guns in other ways from private transfers or from making their own guns. The article goes on to quote the website gun.com, pointing out that further in 2023, there was a continued 53-month-long running trend of consumers purchasing over 1 million firearms per month. Over 1 million firearms per month are being purchased from FFLs. A huge number. But I also want to point out that even though the Zero Hedge article is very powerful talking about the motives and some of the issues and some of the data, there's even more sort of good news from the Second Amendment community that the National Shooting Sports released in the last several days. Specifically, they released data on the most recent firearm production figures from the manufacturing point of view, and they've concluded that today there's over 28 million quote-unquote modern sporting rifles in circulation. Now, the modern sporting rifle phrase I don't like politically. I think the more accurate phrase when we're talking about AR-style firearms and AK-style firearms is not modern sporting rifles. We'll get to why the NSSF uses that, I believe. But the modern sporting rifle name is not best, in my view, when we're litigating the Second Amendment cases, because I think the better phraseology is semi-automatic rifles. Semi-automatic rifles, because it speaks to the semi-automatic handguns that were protected in Heller and referenced in the 2016 Caetano case, both Supreme Court decisions. So I prefer semi-automatic rifles and not modern sporting rifles, but I believe that the National Shooting Sports Foundation likes to use modern sporting rifles because one of their constituents, some of the people they represent, are those that import and export firearms. And I believe, don't quote me on this, but the phrase modern sporting rifles has a unique benefit to those that can import firearms. I think the way this works, and you guys will correct me if I get this wrong, there's a lot of people out there that are FFLs and do this. I'm not an FFL lawyer. I just have a sense about it, but there's a lot of people that actually represent industry and NFLs and all that, so they'll know better than I will. But it's my understanding that to import guns, they have to have a sporting purpose as a general matter, so the modern sporting rifles sort of helps with that sort of theme. Regardless, the semi-automatic rifles are the AR-style firearms, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation. This is what they write. They specifically say that there's approximately over 28.1 million of these rifles in circulation. According to this report from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, the estimated total number of firearms in circulation in civilian possession in the time period of 1990 through 2021 is somewhere in the order of magnitude of 473 million. Now, they're using ATF Firearms Commerce in the United States data, specifically called the Annual Firearms Manufacturing and Exportation Reports and Congressional Research Service, among other data here. They're also using the AFMR data, which, of course, is the ATF's Annual Firearms Manufacturing and Exportation Report, which apparently is up to the 2021 edition. Now, specifically, the National Shooting Sports Foundation argues, or doesn't argue, they lay out this data. They say that the total domestic firearm production reported in 2021 was about just under 13 million firearms, which is an increase of over 28.6% over the 2020 reported figures. So there's clearly a greater and greater demand and greater supply of private firearms in the United States, and that includes, of course, the data associated with semi-automatic rifles, AR-15s, AK-47s, or modern sporting rifles, whatever you want to call them, and the data is indicating that it's over 28.1 million of these rifles are in circulation and have been since 1990. Now, the National Shooting Sports Foundation had a representative, the president and CEO, Joe Bartuzzi, came out and said, quote, The data here continues to show that the modern sporting rifle, again AR-15 style firearms, is the most popular center fire rifle sold in the United States today, with over 28.1 million in circulation and being used for lawful purposes every day. Now, just as a reminder, I want to go back as to why all this is legally relevant. If you go back to the 2016 Supreme Court decision in Caetano versus Massachusetts, which essentially, for all intents and purposes, held that stun guns are in common use. They didn't officially hold that, but that's basically the conclusion they were drawing, and let the Massachusetts courts do the same when they remanded it down there, and then Ms. Caetano was exonerated because the stun gun ban in the state of Massachusetts violated the Second Amendment. This is the critical language from the concurrence of Justice Samuel Alito, where he talks about this. He says specifically that, as the foregoing makes clear, in our opinion, the pertinent Second Amendment inquiry is whether stun guns, which are not firearms, by the way, stun guns are commonly possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes today. The Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts offered only a cursory discussion of that question, noting that the number of tasers and stun guns is dwarfed by the number of firearms. But Justice Alito goes on to say, this observation may be true, but it is besides the point. Justice Scalia wrote, otherwise, a state would be free to ban all weapons except handguns because handguns are the most popular weapon chosen by Americans for self-defense in the home, quoting Heller. Then Justice Alito goes on and makes this powerful observation about what constitutes common use by Americans for lawful purposes. And again, as you know, if they're in common use by Americans for lawful purposes, they cannot be banned under the Second Amendment under the Heller test. This is what Justice Alito writes in the Caetano concurrence. He writes, the more relevant statistic is that hundreds of thousands of tasers and stun guns have been sold to private citizens who, it appears, may lawfully possess them in 45 states. He goes on to conclude that while less popular than handguns, stun guns are widely owned and accepted as a legitimate means of self-defense across the country. Massachusetts' categorical ban on such weapons therefore violates the Second Amendment. Again, put this into perspective, 200,000 civilians own stun guns in and around 2009, which was relied upon in the 2016 Supreme Court decision at Caetano versus Massachusetts and the concurrence by Justice Alito in the same decision. And then compare that to the recent figures of 28.1 million from the National Shooting Sports Foundation, speaking to the number of AK-47s, AR-15s, and other quote-unquote modern sporting rifles, which is really, we're talking about semi-automatic rifles across the United States. And then, of course, you look back at the Zero Hedge article I discussed earlier in this video and realize that there's a bunch of societal problems and concerns that are causing Americans to realize they are their own first responder, and the best way to protect themselves is the same way that Joe Biden does, which is with firearms. Joe Biden doesn't have to carry his own firearm because he's surrounded by men and women with guns that carry those guns for him to protect his life. But I think Americans realize that their own lives and the lives of their family members is just as important as a political elite, a religious elite such as the Pope, who is surrounded by high walls and men with guns, Hollywood elites that surround themselves with armed bodyguards, and of course the billionaire class that indeed has armed security to the tunes, in many respects, to the tune of tens of millions of dollars a year in security costs for some of the greatest and most famous billionaires out there. I don't need to name names. I think you're familiar with them already. So there you have it. A lot of interesting developments. Overall good news. People are recognizing the importance of the right to keep and bear arms more now than ever before. I think that's important to maintain this tradition and respect that the Founding Fathers understood. That's why they put in the Bill of Rights in 1791, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So there you have it. So I hope you learned something here today at the Four Boxes Diner. Make sure you follow me on X at Four Boxes Diner, and please check to make sure you've subscribed to this channel. We keep getting reports that people have been unsubscribed to my channel, even though they're long-standing fans of this channel. So make sure you're subscribed. I'd appreciate it. We're trying to get our numbers up in that regard, and we will see you again soon here at the Four Boxes Diner.
Orders up. Table 2A.